Without further ado, Mr. Daniel James Brown.
Thank you. Thank you guys for coming out. This should be fun. I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes or so, and then I'm going to try to leave some time for questions afterwards. So if you want to be thinking about questions you might have. So The Boys in the Boat is a story, of course, that culminates at the 1936 Olympics in Berlin. Those games are often called the Nazi Olympics. And most people, most Americans, if you ask them about the Nazi Olympics, the 36 Olympics, I think the first thing that's going to come to mind for most Americans is the Jesse Owens story. The story of this great African-American track and field star who won 4 gold medals and put Hitler's racial theories to the lie and embarrassed the Nazis. It's one of those great American stories that we keep alive in our culture, we tell our kids, we put it in textbooks. Because it's one of those stories that sort of reminds us of who we are as a people, the things we value and the things we want to hang on to. Great individual achievement, racial tolerance, basic fairness. I think this story that I'm here to talk about, the story of these 9 young men from Western Washington who went with Jesse Owens on the SS Manhattan to Berlin that summer, I think it's another story that deserves to be kept alive for pretty much the same reason. That is, it's a story that sort of reminds us of who we are as a people and some of the things we value. Now, of course, it's different. It doesn't have the racial component. And it's not a story about great individual achievement. In fact, that's kind of the point. It's a story about a great team achievement. And I think it helps to remind us that as a people, historically, we've been pretty good at pulling together and building great teams and getting great things done together. And, I'm not sure that's, frankly, as true today as it has been historically, but it's part of who we are, and I'll come back to that in a little bit. First of all, let me tell you a little bit about how I came to write this book. About 7 or 8 years ago, my neighbor, Judy, came to me. And she told me that she'd been reading my first book to her dad. But her dad was dying. He was in hospice care, living at her home. And he was enjoying that first book, and he wanted to meet me. So I think it was the next day I went down to Judy's house, and I met this elderly gentleman named Joe Rance. And Joe was stretched out on a recliner, and he was on oxygen, and he was quite weak. But he was very alert mentally. So I sat down next to Joe, and we began to talk. And with some prompting we talked just very briefly about that earlier book. But then with some prompting from Judy, he began to talk about his childhood growing up during the Great Depression. And he had a very poignant story to tell. He talked actually first about his mother dying when he was a toddler and about being shipped east on a train to live with an aunt whom he did not know. He talked about a little later in his childhood being thrown out of the house repeatedly by an uncaring stepmother. And he talked about finally being abandoned in a half-built house out on the Olympic Peninsula. He talked about having to forage in the woods for berries and mushrooms and having to poach salmon out of the river just to survive. And he talked about feeling as if he was disposable, as if he was a disposable boy, as if he was someone that could simply be thrown away. But then he began to talk about how he and his crewmates began to row at the University of Washington starting in the fall of 1933, and how he and his friends, his crewmates, had wound up going to Berlin and rowing against a German boat, a Nazi boat, in front of Adolf Hitler and winning this gold medal. And as Joe was telling me this story, I was just absolutely transfixed by it. But I was noticing that from time to time he was tearing up. And he was tearing up in particular whenever he talked about any of the other boys who had rowed with him in that boat. So I knew there was a lot of heart there. I wasn't quite sure what was going on. But at the end of that first conversation with Joe, I was so taken by this story that I just sort of blurted out. Usually I'm really picky about book topics, but I just thought this was amazing. So I just blurted out. I said, Joe, can I write a book about your life? And that was totally the wrong way to put it. He looked down at his feet and he said, no. And he said it just that way, no. And he shook his head. And my heart kind of sank. But then I'll never forget this, because he looked up and he had those tears in his eyes again. And he sort of croaked out. He said, but you could write a book about the boat. And I didn't know what he meant at first. I thought he meant the Husky Clipper, this beautiful cedar shell, rowing shell, that he raced with with his friends, his crewmates. But then I realized, of course, what he meant by the boat was the boat. But more than that, those boys who had rowed with him 75 years before. More even than that, though, what they had all done together, and more even than that, this thing they had all become together that summer in Berlin. This almost perfect, living, breathing thing that a great crew that has found its swing is. And that's what those tears were about. They were tears of pride. He was remembering this thing with enormous pride. And so then I was just completely blown away when I realized that's what the book needed to be. And so I started the next day. I set out on what turned out to be about a 4.5-year quest to research and write the story, to understand better what those tears were about. And that in time turned into The Boys in the Boat. Now, since the book's come out, I get emails from readers every day. And there's certain things that come up in those emails. And one of the things that comes up probably every day is I get emails from people, and you'll see this in Amazon reviews too. People say, well, I almost didn't read your book because I thought it was about rowing, and really what could be more boring than a book about rowing? In which I have to say, I would have said the same thing 7 or 8 years ago. I had no interest in rowing at all. Fortunately, though, they go on, usually, to say, wow, I was wrong, it's about so much more than rowing. And that's really what I discovered, too, during those 4.5 years when I was interviewing the families of these guys, the last few of them who were still alive, starting to dig into this story. I discovered it was a huge, epic story, really about the human heart. It was a story about this one boy, Joe, who first learned that he couldn't trust anybody in the world, not even his own parents, but then learned that to get where he wanted in life, get what he wanted out of life, he had to learn to trust other people on a very deep, fundamental level. It was a story about an almost mystical figure, this boat builder named George Pocock, and the way he shaped the lives of Joe and these other young men. It was a story about a pretty hard man, Al Ulbrichtson, the coach, who'd grown obsessed with realizing an Olympic dream. It was a love story. It was a story about grit and determination. It was a story about the American genius for defying long odds. It was a story about the cold realities of growing up in this country, in the United States, during the Great Depression and during the Dust Bowl, and just how very hard that was. It was a story about Adolf Hitler and Joseph Goebbels and Leni Riefenstahl and the Nazis, and about propaganda and deceit. And most of all, it was just a story about 9 very hardworking, very decent young men who came together and forged something so much larger than the sum of their parts. Now, that's not to say that rowing isn't an important part of the story. Of course it is. Rowing is very central to the story on one level, and there is a level on which it is a book about rowing. And I just want to take a couple minutes to talk about the rowing part of it before I move on to some of the other things, because I actually have become a huge fan of rowing in the 7 or 8 years since I started this. Rowing, I'm a big fan of rowing, and I'm a big fan of rowers, I have to say. I've met thousands of rowers over the last couple of years, and these are some of the things that I find interesting about their sport. First of all, there's very few things that match rowing, and I'm talking particularly now about rowing at this pretty elite level, this Olympic level. There's very few things that match rowing for the sheer amount of physical energy that it takes, for the output of energy and the toll it takes on the human body. A rowing coach once said that rowing a 2,000-meter Olympic race takes the same toll on the body that playing 2 NBA basketball games would, back to back, but doing it all in about 6 minutes. So you have to be extraordinarily fit to row, particularly, as I say, at this level. There's very few things that match it for teamwork, but also for coordination and synchronization and precision. Another rowing coach said that putting 8 men or women in a shell and asking them to row that 2,000-meter race is like putting them in front of golf balls and giving them golf clubs and asking them to swing and hit those golf balls at precisely the same moment, and then to do that over and over every 2 seconds for the next 6 minutes. That's the degree of precision and synchronization that you have to have with your crewmates. There's a long, colorful history associated with rowing. Excuse me. I don't remember if it was Yale that rowed against, challenged Harvard or the other way around, but in 1852, Yale and Harvard had a boat race, and actually that was the first intercollegiate athletic event of any kind in this country, and all of college sports comes down from that. There's the aesthetics of the sport. The beauty of a crew that's found its swing is actually pretty extraordinary, particularly in these days when they were rowing in these beautiful wooden boats, these beautiful cedar shells. There's the incredible mental toughness, to keep at it. It's a sport that really tries to defeat you in many ways. Your head is as important as anything else in terms of keeping you in that boat, coming back and doing it over and over because it is so trying and often painful. So it's a sport that involves a lot of mental toughness, and as I say, I've come to admire the men and women who do this enormously. I think it's a very character-building sport. And then finally, crew actually, there's a lot more drama in a crew race than you might think. I don't think you probably have a lot of opportunities to watch crew races around here. But if you ever have watched one, it's frankly not the most spectacular spectator sport you ever saw. You stand on the edge of the waterway and the boats come down, they go by and they disappear, and that's the experience pretty much. Nevertheless, in the 1920s and 1930s, perhaps because there weren't 20 channels of sports on cable TV at any given moment, rowing actually was enormously popular as a spectator sport, and there actually is a lot of drama involved in the sport. It's just that so much of it takes place inside the boat. And one of the things I wanted to do with this book was put you as readers in the boat so you could experience that drama firsthand. And then a lot of the drama during this era in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, a lot of the drama came from the fact that it was so popular as a fan sport. 100,000 people would turn out to watch one of these crew races. I mean, that's like a Rose Bowl full of people. Important races were broadcast live coast to coast on the radio, and millions of people would tune in to listen to them. Millions of dollars were bet on these races. A coxswain's sore throat could make headlines in the newspapers. And actually at the Berlin Olympics in 1936, the rowing facility out in a place called Grunau was actually the second largest venue at the 36 games, second only to this massive coliseum that the Nazis built in central Berlin. So it was enormously popular, and there was a lot of color and a lot of excitement surrounding these events. And I actually have a passage I'd like to read to sort of, I hope, illustrate some of that excitement and some of that drama both inside the boat and outside the boat. But I'm going to pick it up in the middle of a race, so I sort of need to set the scene here and remind you, if you've read the book, or tell you if you haven't, what's going on here. This race takes place in June of 1936. So this is the summer these guys hope to go to the Olympics later that year. It's in Poughkeepsie, New York. It's the de facto national championship. There are about 100,000 people there to watch this race. And many of them are in hundreds of boats lining the last mile or so of the river. Everything from rowboats to a Navy destroyer that's there to root for the Naval Academy rowers. The race goes off about 6 p.m. as dusk is falling over the Hudson River. Now, to realize their dream of going on to the Olympics later that year, these kids from Washington, they really need to win this race. And in particular, they need to defeat their arch rivals from Cal Berkeley. Kai Ebright, the coach at Cal, has won the 3 previous national championships. But more important, he has twice taken Cal Berkeley to the Olympics and brought gold medals back to Berkeley. Al Olbrechtsen, Washington's coach, desperately wants to keep Kai Bright from doing it again. He desperately wants to bring a gold medal home to Seattle. He's grown absolutely obsessed with this. He's told his wife Hazel that if he can't go all the way and win the gold in Berlin, he's done with coaching. So everything is on the line for Al Ulbrichtsen as he's watching this race unfold. Now, Al Ulbrichtsen, I should say, is a very reticent man. He doesn't like to display his emotions, particularly in front of his boys, the boys that row for him, and particularly in front of sports writers who are always trying to get information out of him. He's often called the man with the stone face. So he's watching this race unfold. He's watching it from a train that runs, an observation train that runs along the river parallel to the race course. And he's told Bobby Mock, his coxswain, the coxswain's the short person who sits in the back of the boat, only person looking forward, steering the boat, but also controlling the pace of the boat. Al Ulbrichtsen has told his coxswain, Bobby Mock, to race from behind for most of the race, but under no circumstances to get more than 2 lengths behind. But now, if we pick it up, they've been rowing 3 miles. This is a really long race. This is a 4-mile race. For 3 miles, Bobby Mock has been holding the boat a staggering 4 lengths behind. And Al Ulbrichtsen's sitting on this train watching this kid, and he can't figure out what he's doing, and he's growing more and more concerned about what he's seeing. So let me pick it up from there. On the train, Al Ulbrichtsen had all but given up. "They're too far behind," he muttered. "They're overplaying their hand. We'll be lucky to finish third." Ulbrichtsen's face was ashen. It seemed to have turned entirely to stone. He'd even stopped chewing his gum. In the lane nearest to him, California had powered back out in front, rowing beautifully. With a tiring field behind them and less than a mile to go, Cal was in a commanding position to win. Kai Bright, it seemed, had somehow outwitted him again. But if anybody had outwitted Al Ulbrichtsen, it was his coxswain, the short kid with his own Phi Beta Kappa key. And now he would show his hand. Suddenly he leaned into Don Hume's face and bellowed, "Give me 10 hard ones for Ulbrichtsen." 8 long spruce oars bowed in the water 10 times. Then Mock bellowed again, "Give me 10 more for Pocock." Another 10 enormous strokes. Then a lie. "Here's California. We're on them. 10 more big ones for Mom and Dad." Very slowly, the Husky Clipper slipped past Columbia and began to creep up on Navy in second. Someone on the train idly remarked, "Well, Washington's picking up." But a minute later, someone else called out much more urgently, "Look at Washington. Look at Washington. Here comes Washington." On the train and on shore, all eyes shifted from the leaders to 8 white blades barely visible out in the middle of the river. Another deep guttural roar began to rise from the crowd. It seemed impossible for Washington to close the gap. They were half a mile from the finish now, in third place, still 2 lengths back, but now they were moving, and the way they were moving compelled immediate and absolute attention. In the boat, Mock was incandescent. "Okay, now," he barked, and Don Hume took the stroke up to 35, then to 36, then to 37. On the starboard side, Joe Rance fell in behind him, just as smooth as silk, and the boat began to swing. The bow began to rise out of the water, and Washington slid past the middies as if the Navy boat were pinned to the water. Cal's coxswain, Grover Clark, glanced across the river, and for the first time since he left it behind at the starting line, he saw the Washington boat sweeping up on his stern. Stunned, he bellowed at his crew to pick it up, and Cal's rate climbed quickly to 38. Mock hollered at Hume to take it up another notch, and Washington went to 40. The rhythm of the California boat seemed to waver and then grow erratic. California and Washington careened into the last 500 yards, storming down the corridor of open water between the spectators' boats. People in rowboats were standing up now, risking a dunking to see what was happening. Some of the large excursion steamers began to list toward the center of the river as people crowded their rails. The roar of the crowd began to engulf the oarsmen. Boat whistles shrieked. In the Washington press car, pandemonium broke out. George Farnell of the Seattle Times shoved his press credentials into his mouth and began to devour them. Tom Bowles commenced beating a stranger on the back with his lucky old fedora. Royal Brougham was shouting, "Come on, Washington, come on." Only Al Ulbrichtsen remained motionless and silent, still riveted to his seat, his eyes cold gray stones locked on the white blades out in the river. With the finish line looming ahead of them in the gathering dark, Bobby Mock screamed something inarticulate. Johnny White suddenly had the sensation that they were flying now, not rowing. Stub McMillan desperately wanted to peek, to glance over toward lane 1 where he knew California would be, but he didn't dare. In number 6, over the crowd noise, Shorty Hunt could hear someone on a radio yelling frantically. He tried to make out the words, but all he could tell was that something terribly exciting was happening. He had no idea how things stood except that he still hadn't seen the California boat fall into his field of view. Then, in the last 200 yards, thinking itself fell away, and pain suddenly came shrieking back into the boat, descending on all of them at once, searing their legs, their arms, their shoulders, clawing at their backs, tearing at their hearts and lungs as they desperately gulped at the air. And in those last 200 yards, in an extraordinary burst of speed, rowing at 40 strokes per minute, Washington passed California. With each stroke, the boys took their rivals down by the length of another seat, and by the time the two boats crossed the line, in the last vestiges of twilight, a glimmer of open water showed between the stern of the Husky Clipper and the bow of the California Clipper. In the press car, the corners of Al Ulbrichtsen's mouth twitched reluctantly into something vaguely resembling a smile. He resumed chewing his gum, slowly and methodically. Standing next to him, George Pocock threw back his head and howled like a banshee. Tom Bowles continued to flog the back of the fellow in front of him with his old fedora. George Farnell removed the well-masticated remains of his press credentials from his mouth. In Seattle, Hazel Ulbrichtsen and her son Al Jr. pounded the glass top of their coffee table until it shattered into dozens of pieces. And in the boat, the boys pumped their fists in the dark night air. For a long while, Ulbrichtsen just sat there, staring into the darkness as fans came rushing through the car, congratulating him and slapping him on the back. When he finally stood up, reporters crowded around him, and he said simply, "Well, they made it close, but they won." Then he elaborated, "I guess that little runt knew what he was doing." And that's the moment, the nature of that comeback was so stunning that that's really, I think, the moment at which these guys knew how good they were. It was the moment at which Al Ulbrichtsen realized what he had in that boat, I think. And sports writers, every major sports writer in the country was there that day. Sports writers very much took note, and everybody started predicting that this was a boat that could go to Germany and win the gold medal. And so 2 weeks later in Princeton, New Jersey, they rowed again for the official Olympic trials, and Washington again beat California and everybody else in the field and won the right to go on to Berlin as Team USA. And then the story culminates, of course, in this great gold medal race in Berlin, and we're actually going to show you that here in just a second. Let me, again, though, remind you of what these guys were up against that day that they rowed for the gold medal. It was a windy day, and that was a problem because the American boat, these guys from Washington, the American boat had turned in the fastest qualifying time. The British boat had turned in the second fastest qualifying time. But they were mysteriously assigned lanes 5 and 6 out in the windiest part of the race course. The Italian boat and the German boat had turned in slow qualifying times. They were assigned lanes 1 and 2, which are protected the whole length of the race course, essentially the whole length from the winds. So these guys were going to have to row into a quartering headwind the whole race course, basically. That was a big problem. To complicate things, the American stroke, Don Hume, the stroke is the guy that sits right in front of the coxswain. He's setting the rhythm that everybody else in the boat is going to replicate. So he's absolutely critical. He needs to be setting the right pace at all time because that's what all 8 oars in the boat are going to be doing. Don Hume, the American stroke, had been ill on and off for weeks with some kind of respiratory infection. He'd been running a high fever for the last few days before the gold medal race. Coach Ulbrichtsen wasn't even going to put him in the boat. He was so sick. He had him in bed. He only put him in the boat at the last minute because the other guys went to Ulbrichtsen, and very uncharacteristically, he didn't do this with Al Ulbrichtsen. They went to Ulbrichtsen and they said, "Don's got to be in the boat. He's come this far with us. He's got to be in that boat with us." Ulbrichtsen at the last moment relented, put Don Hume in the boat, but he was a very sick kid when he climbed into that boat. There were about 75,000 people there that day, mostly German, although there were significant numbers of Americans and other Europeans there. As the rowing events were about to get underway, Adolf Hitler and Joseph Goebbels and Hermann Goering and pretty much the whole top of the hierarchy of the Nazi Party entered the regatta grounds dressed in dark rain cloaks. The whole crowd got to their feet, gave the Nazi salute, began to chant Sieg Heil, Sieg Heil. The Nazis went up on the balcony of a boathouse they had built, big stone boathouse they had built for the occasion, and the rowing events got underway. Germany promptly won gold medals in the first 5 rowing events that day, leading up to the 8-oared race, which is the big prestige event. But the German crowd was getting more and more excited as Germany won medal after medal after medal. So as the guys are rowing out to the starting line, the crowd is just roaring, Deutschland, Deutschland, Deutschland. They line up at the starting position. They're out in the windiest part of the course. Because it's so windy out there, they don't hear when the start of the race is just with a voice call and the drop of a flag. They're positioned so they can't see the flag. They don't hear the start because it's carried away by the wind. They don't know the race has begun until the boat to one side of them lurches forward. They dig with everything they have. They row out into the middle of the Langer Sea, this body of water they're rowing on. But 1,000 meters down the race course, halfway through the race, Bobby Mock, the coxswain's the only guy facing forward. He's looking down the race course. He and the Brits are tied for dead last. He's watching waves break over the bow of his boat, and he's watching Germany and Italy streak down lanes 1 and 2 toward what appear to be inevitable gold medal and silver medal finishes. But that's not, of course, how it ends. I'm going to show you how it ends. You won't see the American boat. You might get a glimpse of them at the very beginning. They'll be at the very top of your screen. But then they quickly disappear. And you won't see them again until the last 100 meters or so of the race course, at which point they will be very much back in contention. And you will see that, make sure I got this here. They'll be at the very top of the screen, and they're very, very much back in contention.
Die Entscheidung im Achter. Schweiz, Ungarn, England, Amerika, Italien und Deutschland. Zum ersten Mal bei den Olympischen Spielen hat sich ein deutscher Achter bis zur Entscheidung durchgekämpft.
So the guys on the far side, they're out of it. These are the Italians coming from.
Italien kommt auf. Deutschland greift an. Deutschland holt auf. Zieht gleich. Die Wikinger gehen in Führung. Der Endkampf ist entbrannt. Die letzten 100 Meter, das deutsche Boot im Vordergrund. Daneben mit weißem Stirntuch die Italiener. Dahinter die Ungarn, neben diesen England. Auf der Außenbahn aber führt Amerika. Deutschland kommt auf. Meter um Meter. Zu spät, zu spät. Amerika hat gesiegt. Erster Amerika. Zweiter Belgien. Dritter Deutschland.
There's Bobby Hawk. Don Newton starting to feel better. Joe Lance. Shorty Line. So that clip is from a big documentary / propaganda film that Leni Riefenstahl, a filmmaker who worked for the Nazis, made in 1936. I think it was actually released in 1937. And Leni Riefenstahl's a whole story unto herself. But whatever else she was a pretty amazing filmmaker. And if you're wondering, there weren't cameras in the boats, if you're wondering about those close-ups. All the pulled back footage she shot the day of the race, but then she got the Americans to Germans and the Italians to row again the next day, and she did put cameras in the boats, and she put them right in the faces of the oarsmen and the coxswains. And then she went and she spliced those, she's cut those into the footage of the race. And you notice she did it at a more and more frenetic pace as the race nears its climax. And also, they get the jumpy camera effect. So it sort of builds, I think it's a pretty amazing piece of film. It builds the excitement pretty well. Along with, as I say, I get email comments all the time, and along with the comment about expecting the book to be boring, there's a couple other comments that come up over and over. And they are interesting to me, not so much in themselves, but when I put them together. So let me just tell you quickly what those are. I get email every day. This is the single most common email I get. I get email from every day, I think more from men than from women, who tell me that they finished the book and they really enjoyed it and they have tears in their eyes as they're finishing it. And the other one is, I get emails very frequently, not every day, but quite often I get emails from people on one side or the other of our current political chasm, who say basically, well, if only people on the other side would read this book, the world would be a much, much better place. And I think that's really interesting. I mean, the book isn't intended to be political in any way. But I think what's interesting is, okay, what is it that makes such a wide range of people have such an emotional reaction to this book, that it brings tears to their eyes in many cases, even though they're coming from really different viewpoints of our world? What is it that is causing that kind of reaction? And I think some of it for older people is nostalgia, remembering these days, remembering a time when the world seemed simpler in a lot of ways, or maybe remembering their youth when they had bonding experiences like this. But I think the main part of it is this, and that is that at the end of the book, there's an epilogue, and in the epilogue, I talk about these young men having the rest of their lives and eventually growing old and dying. And I think readers are just sad to see these guys go at the end of the book. I think they've gotten attached to them. I think they're fond of them. So then that raises a question, again, sort of the same question, okay, why? What is it that's so attractive about these guys? What is it that makes people have this fondness to the point that they're tearing up just reading about their deaths? So I've been thinking about that a lot lately, and I may not have the right answer or answers, but these are some of the things that I think may be going on. I think there are certain qualities that these young men had, character traits, whatever you want to call them, I think that are sort of universally appealing to us, regardless of age or political affiliation or religion or whatever. There are certain characteristics that they had that I think both are attractive to us, but also that I think in many cases have a lot to do with their success. So I just want to quickly go through some of those. First of all, it's just simple. I think these guys are easy for many of us to identify with and sympathize with. Their humble origins sort of stamp them as quintessentially American. These are kids that grew up in Western Washington in mill towns and on dairy farms or in mining camps. They grew strong, mostly wielding axes and pitchforks and shovels. But to get where they got, to get into that boat and go to Berlin, they had to go up against these, pretty rural, working class kids from Washington. They had to go up against, first, their very good rivals at Cal Berkeley and vanquish them. Then they go and row against and defeat kids from the East Coast schools. And the kids that rowed on the East Coast in those days tended to be the sons of, I'm talking about men here because it was a men's program, the sons of titans of industry, or US senators, or even presidents of the United States. FDR had two sons rowing at the same time that these guys were rowing. These were kids that had learned to row in prep schools, okay? They had to take them on and vanquish them. Then in the preliminaries in Berlin, they had to take on and defeat kids from Oxford and Cambridge in the UK, kids who were literally aristocrats in some cases. And then finally, they had to take on and defeat a hand-picked Nazi crew. So they were classic American underdogs. They were constantly taking on higher and higher levels of power and prestige, and I think that tends to appeal to Americans, to all of us. Second, and this is very closely related, it's very hard not to admire their extraordinary resilience. The kids that made it into that boat were the end product of a selection process that actually whittled hundreds of boys down to the 9 that got to go to Berlin. They were the ones that kept coming back and getting in that boat week after week, month after month, year after year for 3 years, rowing out on Lake Washington in the winter, where, believe me, it's miserable. It's so cold, your hands are numb, you can't feel the oars. Ice builds up in your oar locks. It's always either stinging rain or sleet or snow, and always bitter cold wind. These guys kept coming, and Ulbrichtson was extremely demanding as a coach, so he's always barking at them. He's always yanking kids out of boats. They kept coming back despite all that. In the middle of the Great Depression, at a time when they were having a hard time getting a couple square meals a day, they kept coming back over and over. And I think that mental toughness, that resilience, is just absolutely amazing. And I should say also that part of that resilience comes from the nature of rowing. One of the things about rowing at this competitive level is when you're rowing with 7 other men or women in that boat pulling oars, there comes a time in every race when you don't want to take another stroke. It's painful. It hurts. You're running out of oxygen. You don't want to take the next stroke, but you have to. You don't have any choice because everybody else in the boat is depending on you, not only to take that stroke, but to take as hard a stroke, as clean a stroke as you can. So it's a sport that demands resilience. It demands that you keep doing something that at the moment your body's telling you you don't want to do. The third thing that I think is extraordinary about them and a hallmark of their success is that they were earnest. Now let me explain what I mean by earnest. I mean simply that they took great pride in how well they rowed every time they rowed. Now they took great pride, of course, when they went to Berlin representing their country. Anybody would. The thing about these guys is that by the summer of 1936, really by the spring of 1936, these guys were taking pride in how well they rowed every time they went out for a practice. And that really came, that attitude came from this figure, George Pocock, the boat builder. The thing about Pocock is he was a boat builder. He was also a very good oarsman. He was a boat builder, but what he really was the consummate craftsman. And he believed that by doing whatever you do as well as you possibly can, by approaching it as a craft, you lift yourself up. He would say to these boys, when I build a boat and I walk away from it, I leave a piece of my heart in that boat. When you row, whether it's a practice or a race, when you get out of the boat, you need to leave a piece of your heart in that boat. He taught them that by doing that, by approaching their rowing that way, they would elevate themselves. They would make better men of themselves. There was even a spiritual dimension for Pocock to approaching life this way. He said many things like this, but he said, it's an art, it's a great art is rowing. It's the finest art there is. It's a symphony of motion. And when you're rowing well, why, it's nearing perfection. And when you near perfection, you're touching the divine. Fourth thing is the extraordinary mutual trust and respect that they developed for one another. Trust, first of all, is just like amazingly important in rowing. These shells are only about 24 inches wide. The moment you climb into one, every movement you make with your body affects everybody else in the boat. A flick of a wrist at the wrong time can ruin a race for everybody in the boat. So you're trusting everybody else to be doing the right thing at every moment. You're rowing with your back to the finish line. You literally can't even see where you're going. So you're trusting the coxswain to be doing the right thing at all moments. You're trusting every other man or woman in the boat to be putting his or her whole strength into every pull of the boat. So it's a sport that's all about trust. Crews don't work if they aren't built on trust. And by the spring of 1936, these guys, these 9 young men, trusted one another on a level that's really hard to do justice to. They had come to respect each other so deeply. One place I got a glimpse into it was the summer they were in Berlin in August, late July and August when they were in Berlin. Every one of them either kept a diary or wrote a letter home to mom and dad. At some point that summer, every one of them said something to the effect of, "Mom, it would be really swell if I could bring a gold medal home to Seattle, but most of all, I just hope I don't let the other guys down." That was the thing that mattered to them. Even more than winning a gold medal, they didn't want to let one another down. And they retained that, believe me, they retained those bonds till the last of them, Roger Morris, finally passed away. They were just amazingly close for the rest of their lives. Then the final thing I want to mention as a hallmark of their success, and also I think part of what makes them so attractive to us, endears us to them, is maybe the least obvious, but to my mind maybe in some ways the most important. And that is that every one of these guys by the spring of 1936 had developed a measure of humility. Now, make no mistake, these guys were big, strapping young men. They had healthy egos. It's a pretty audacious thing to think you're going to win an Olympic gold medal in something as tough as rowing. So they had healthy egos. But after 3 years of rowing together, rowing out there on Lake Washington, rowing past pain over and over again, they learned that there were things they could do better together than they could do separately. They learned that they needed one another. And it taught them to begin to listen to one another. It taught them to begin to listen to their coaches. It taught them to begin to listen to what Pocock was really saying. And I really think that little bit of humility that they gradually acquired through the rigors of what they were doing is the gateway through which they were able to open their hearts and start building those bonds of respect and trust for one another. And again, the humility was something they hung on to for the rest of their lives. These guys, after they did come home with that gold medal, every one of them basically took that gold medal and put it in a sock drawer or put it in a box up in the attic and went about their lives. They needed to get a job to get through another year at school because they were all earning their way through school. And some of them, a couple of them, never even mentioned they had a gold Olympic medals to their own children until their children were adults. They just didn't talk about it. It was not in their nature to talk about it. And I think that humility served them well, not just as rowers, but for pretty much everything that they tried to do later in life. So when I stand back from this story and think about what it means to me, it means a lot of different things. But I think, for one thing, it's a great metaphor, I think, for anything that you might want to do in a team context, whether it's at school or at work or at church. I think any time that you find yourself needing to become part of a team, I think looking at what these guys did and some of the character traits that they developed and contemplating those and seeing how those might work in your own context can genuinely be helpful. But ultimately, I think it's about something larger than that. For me, it's really about what that generation of Americans did, and in some ways it is a contrast with what my generation has done, at least. I won't try to say anything about your generation because you guys mostly are just getting started. But I'm talking about the generation for me is my mother and my father, my aunt and my uncle, what Tom Brokaw called the greatest generation. This is the generation that during the Great Depression, pretty much everybody that lived through that time was taught a dose of humility. Life was so hard. There were so many things to overcome during the Depression that very few people went through that experience without learning that they needed one another, that there were things they could do better if they learned to pull together. And that's what that generation did. And they really did. They built these great monuments like the Grand Coulee Dam and so forth. But much more than that, they won World War II on not one but two fronts. An amazing thing. And then they went on after the war to build the most prosperous era in our history. So I'm a huge fan of that generation. I really think these guys are great representatives of that generation. And as I say, I think their story is a good metaphor for it. So I'm going to wind up by just reading two paragraphs from the end of the book. I wanted, before I wrote the chapters about events in Berlin, I wanted to go to Germany and see the rowing regatta grounds for myself. And while I was there, I had an opportunity to go up on the balcony where Hitler had stood to watch this race. And that was, first of all, it was a pretty creepy experience, to tell you the truth. But it also was a pretty emotional experience for me as I was thinking about what had happened that day. So I just want to read you what was going through my head. I visited the Wassersport Museum in Grunau, where late in the afternoon, Werner Philipp, the director, kindly led me up a set of stairs to the balcony of Haus West. I stood there for a long, quiet minute, where Hitler stood 75 years before, gazing out over the Langer Sea, seeing it much as he saw it. Down below me, young men were unloading a shell from a truck, singing something softly in German, and preparing for an evening row. Out on the water, a single sculler, his blades glinting, worked his way down one of the lanes towards the large Zeil sign at the end of the course. Closer to me, swallows flew low over the water on silent wings, silhouetted against the declining sun, touching the water from time to time, dimpling the silver surface. Standing there, watching them, it occurred to me that when Hitler watched Joe and the boys fight their way back from the rear of the field to sweep ahead of Italy and Germany 75 years ago, he saw but did not recognize heralds of his doom. He could not have known that one day hundreds of thousands of boys just like them, boys who shared their essential natures, decent and unassuming, not privileged or favored by anything in particular, just loyal, committed, and perseverant, would return to Germany, dressed in olive drab, hunting him down. They are almost all gone now, the legions of young men who saved the world in the years just before I was born. But that afternoon, standing on the balcony of Haus West, I was swept with gratitude for their goodness and their grace, their humility and their honor, their simple civility, and all the things they taught us before they flitted across the evening water and finally vanished into the night. Thank you. Thank you. So I would be glad to take any questions you might have, either about anything really, hopefully something related to the book. I didn't talk much about the writing of the book, so I'm certainly be glad to talk about that more if people are curious about my process or how I think about the process or anything like that. Yes? Have I ever been in a boat? Yeah, so I have been in boats a number of times. I've held an oar. You couldn't call it rowing. That would be I have flailed at the oars and made a fool of myself. It's a lot harder, and I don't just mean physically hard, like how backbreakingly hard it is. It's just hard technically. I mean, getting the blades in and out of the water, feathering the blades, rotating the blades, it's a lot harder than it looks. It looks, when it's being done well, it looks effortless, it looks graceful. It's actually really hard. So I cannot call myself a rower. I had the help of a lot. One of the things that happened is when I started working on this book, the people down at the current University of Washington Shell House found out what I was doing. And this story redounds to the greater glory of Washington rowing. So they were very eager to help me. So they took me out on the launch with their coaches. They hooked me up with some Olympic quality rowers. they taught me a ton about rowing. So I had a lot of help.
Sorry. I wanted to ask, you might have said it in the book, but I can't remember. Have you met personally any of the other rowers beside Joe?
Yeah, so when I started this, only Joe and Roger Morris were still alive. And Joe died about 2.5 months after I met him. So my time with him was mostly the first month because he got weaker and weaker. And then Roger lived for about another year. To be perfectly honest, though, Roger was 90-something, and his memory was pretty weak at that point. So I had to rely mostly on the children of these guys. And I was really lucky, in particular in regards to Joe Rance. Judy, his daughter Judy, had followed her dad around for the last 5 years or so of his life with a pad of paper and a pencil, asking him the most incredibly detailed questions about everything, about his abandonment. And so even after Joe died, I had these notebooks that Judy had saved with all of this rich detail about her dad. And then the other thing that happened is that when the families of the other 8 guys in the boat found out what I was doing, they'd all been living with this story for 75 years at the time. They had all wanted told, so they started coming to me with diaries and letters and news clippings and photographs. And they sat down with me for probably hundreds of hours of interviews about their dad, or in a couple cases their granddad. So the families helped a great deal too. Anybody else? See one down here in the front.
We want to use the mic so that the video can have that.
As an author, do you have a little bit of Joe Rance in you?
Do I have I have to say, writing this book has affected me way more than the other books I've written. And it has given me a lot of things to think about in terms of emulating these guys. I mean, I'm the 60s generation. We're pretty self-indulgent baby boomer generation. And there's many things my generation did I think are great. But I have learned a lot by looking at what these guys did, studying how they approached life, and probably Joe more than anybody else. I mean, Joe's certainly the most developed character in the book because I had so much to work with Joe. The way Joe approached life, and I have to say this, when I knew him, he was dying, and he knew he was dying. It was in the last couple of months of his life. He was still relentlessly optimistic, and he was not bitter. Like, his stepmother was really pretty nasty to him. And he would talk about that. He told us the story. But he had basically no bitterness in his heart for towards Thula, towards his stepmother. He had just wanted to have a family again. Okay, he just wanted to be let back in the family. So he managed to get through all that tough experience, all that rejection, basically being thrown away, and come out the other end of it without being deeply bitter. In fact, being just the opposite, looking for the good in people, looking for the good in life. And so, yeah, he's made a huge impression on me. Yes?
So, in talking to Joe and doing all your research, I'm in my 40s, and I worry about the lack of, as technology gets developed and invented, I worry about future generations, current included, because I believe hard work keeps you humble. I'm sure you've heard that. And it sort of adds to personality development, as far as knowing that something that's just going to take time, and you have to have the mental toughness to go step by step and eventually get to that end point. Do you have any insight that you got from writing this book that kind of gives you an opinion about that?
Well, you have to explain a little more what you mean. You mean in terms of?
In terms of, so for me personally, I'm worried about, for example, physical labor, a project that's going to take reliable individuals to do their tasks to this level, and it's going to take mental toughness because of the physical exertion. Yeah. But physical exertion seems to be dipping down, especially in the workplace, because of technology development.
Right. Yeah.
So do you have an opinion on that based on what you learned with Joe and your research?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you can come away from this story without recognizing that that physical exertion, that having to overcome obstacles, in the long run, makes one stronger and better equipped to handle life. I mean, it's just a fact. But you know, it's a complicated question because I'm a parent of 2 daughters. And on the one hand, I know that to be true. On the other hand, as a parent, I find myself when they were little especially, knocking every obstacle they came up against down for them. And I think as parents of my generation, at least, we have a tendency to do that. But then that was the question, do you really want your kid to have to suffer what Joe Rance suffered? Do you want to go drive away and leave him on a porch someplace? So, you know, it's a balancing act. I mean, suffering's not really good, generally speaking. Hardship is not really good. But on the other hand, yeah, if you never experience it, if you don't have stuff to overcome fairly early in life, sooner or later you're going to have something hard to deal with, whether it's a cancer diagnosis or a divorce or whatever. I do think that there's got to be a balance there someplace. Yeah.
I am really interested in becoming an author, and I'm wondering if you have any tips or any advice for people who want to be authors.
Yeah, so I get asked that a lot, and I wish I had just a few pithy words. I don't, but I'll tell you a couple things. One is I didn't start writing until I was 50 years old, and I really regret that. I wish I had started much earlier. I wish I had started doing it seriously early. Now, maybe I didn't have enough to say when I was 22. I don't know. But that would have been okay. I wish I'd done it anyway, because it is definitely something you get better at as you do more of it, and particularly as you expose what you've written to the world and get feedback on it and see what works and what doesn't work. It's something that one gets better at the more one does. So as I say, I regret not starting earlier. The other thing I'd say about it is, and it's kind of a cliche, but it's true, that you got to stick with it in the face of what are likely to be overwhelming odds for a long time. You know, when I started this, even though I started in my 50s, it took me, for my first book, I didn't know any better, so I just wrote the book first and then tried to sell it. It turns out with nonfiction books, that's not how you do it. You write a book proposal, and then you get a contract, and then you write the book. But I didn't know that, so I wrote the book. And then I spent about 2 years just trying to get a literary agent. And I have at home a box full of rejection letters, probably nearly 100 in there. And you know, so that was 2 years of sitting there getting rejection letter after rejection letter after rejection letter. And it's very hard not to get discouraged because the odds are often very long. But then a little break happened. You know, I sold that first book for a little tiny bit of money to a very obscure publisher. But then that got noticed, it got some pretty good reviews. That caused a bigger publisher to buy the paperback rights for that book. That led to a much better contract for the second book, and then that led to The Boys in the Boat. So, as I say, I know it's a cliche to some extent, but you just have to stick with it even when you're not getting validated as much as you would like to. And then just keep doing it. Yes, sir.
Because after reading the book, I made a connection culturally because from Hawaii, we have the same thing, same concept, but it's open ocean. Oh, yeah. Which is pretty much the same thing, but more grueling. Yeah. And tiring, because I have a lot of cousins that does something called the Molokai Hoi, which is from Molokai to Oahu. Yeah. Which is not easy, and that most feel unaccomplished if they don't come in first. But my cousin and they came in first, and I just talk story with them all the time. And it was pretty much like how you described in the book, how it's all becoming like one family, or like since they're all boys, it's all about building the brotherhood between them, and that you can trust someone with your life, knowing that
Yeah.
if the canoe was to flip, then you could possibly drown in
Yeah.
rough waters.
Yeah, well, thanks for sharing. That's absolutely true.
So thank you for rating,
Oh,
because
thank
I
you.
made a great connection.
Thank you. I mean, and it doesn't have to be in a boat necessarily, but that kind of experience, something that's hard, something you share with other people, something where there's high stakes involved. Boy, I mean, there's nothing else like it in terms of bonding with people and building something that'll last for a long time in terms of relationships. Is that boats with outriggers? Is that canoes with, yeah. That's Molokai to Oahu? That's cool.
Another thing called Red Bull, and they just made a canoe paddling team, and yeah, it's just a short documentary of like how they are, which is pretty much how the book is. So if you would like to look into it,
So
it's
what's it called again, the documentary?
Red Bull Canoe, or like just paddling, Red Bull Canoe paddling.
Okay,
It's kind of new. They just made it this past year.
cool.
So it's like Red Bull, and it's kind of extreme. The opening scene is them paddling out from a beach, and then all you see is this big wave come, and the whole boat just goes straight vertical, and you can see everyone leaning forward and just digging their paddles into the water, and it's
Oh, man.
just like really eye-opening, because you can see how they work with Mother Nature, even though it pushes against them, showing that everything works in harmony, and everything, if you can find that right harmony or that right pitch, then everything just flows and everything becomes happy and easily. So like my cultural connection is that, like, even though coming from Hawaii, this is a big change.
Sure.
If I can just connect with stuff, it just makes things easier.
Yeah. I love that that basic Hawaiian philosophy is a beautiful thing. I've
Yeah.
seen it other places.
Because after reading it, I was like, oh yeah, this
Cool.
reminds